So my name is Peter Morse, and my pronouns are he, him. I'm going to talk a little bit about wilderness. I hope I don't get into the weeds too much about land management or the law, but I'll do it a little bit. For me, desolate and isolated wilderness lands are perhaps my religion. Though biblically or culturally, wilderness was not a land to love. Indeed, it was a land to convert. Historically, wilderness in Western literature is seen as an undesirable landscape. Biblically, Abraham cast his sons into the wilderness, and Moses led his people into the desolate desert wilderness to wander for an arid 40 years. Here in the U.S., we relied upon the biblical concept of converting untamed lands to Eden-like gardens and the cultural concept of manifest destiny, in which we journeyed forever westward to convert wilderness to uses like agriculture, cattle grazing, timber harvesting, and mining. In so doing, we decimated the indigenous communities whose culture and spiritual practices generally depended on coexistence with the natural world. Beginning in the 1800s, a movement began to blossom where we, the collective descendants of European colonizers, began to question our apartness from nature, demonstrated, of course, by the writings of Thoreau and Emerson. Then, early in the 1900s, we as a country created the National Park Service under the prosaic name, the Organic Act of 1916. Thus, land that was once viewed only for extractive resources like timber, minerals, and agriculture, or as simply surplus, was getting a second look as lands having intrinsic value. That is, value to themselves alone, not necessarily value to us as humans. The forming of how we as citizens of the U.S. view the landscape was beginning to change. And the passage of the Wilderness Act in 1964 is our finest example of land protected for its own intrinsic value. Elliot Porter, famed photographer and wilderness advocate, coined the term, "In wilderness is the preservation of the world." The idea of public wilderness is a uniquely American idea that was spearheaded by the likes of Mr. Porter and so many of his contemporaries. 48 years after the creation of the National Park Service, Congress passed the Wilderness Act of 1964. It is far from a perfect act. However, within that act are measures that tighten the protection of vast landscapes, not for the benefit of humans, but for the humbling benefits of the ebb and flow of life that is untrammeled by human ways. The word untrammeled I first heard in my ear when I was listening to the politics of the Wilderness Act, confused it with untrampled. Kind of sounds the same. But untrammeled was an important word of the act, and it's not only legally critical, but it's also a lovely word. Wild areas would remain untrammeled by humans. The word untrammeled implies that ecological and evolutionary forces continue to operate without restraint, modification, or manipulation. Pretty cool. I, as a youthful Boy Scout and as a young adult, would visit various de facto wildernesses in the High Sierra. I recall learning about the Wilderness Act and confusing untrammeled with untrampled during my many visits to a particular glaciated granitic landscape that was then known as the Immigrant Primitive Area. Then, as part of the California Wilderness Bill, in 1975, that incredibly beautiful landscape was legally changed to the immigrant wilderness. It's now protected and managed as an untrammeled landscape and has been that way for the last almost 50 years. I've been incredibly lucky to hike and pack in landscapes worthy of spiritual awe. Directly out of college, I was hired by the Gila National Forest in New Mexico, and I remember as a 22-year-old driving into the Burro Mountains, which are a component of the Gila. I felt myself emotionally drawn to this landscape. The Burros are really just a collection of steep rocky hills dotted with pinyon pine and Utah juniper. Yet their aloneness and their loveliness I had not previously seen nor felt. These trees, some would consider oversized shrubs, have danced in summer storms and winter snow for hundreds and hundreds of years, all growing somewhat equidistant apart with little in the way of undergrowth. And that's because pinyon and juniper have a chemical in their root systems that retard or outcompete other plants. Well, let me digress a little here and talk about the Gila wilderness. It's important to our wilderness system, and Aldo Leopold, father of the wilderness land ethic. In the 19-teens, Mr. Leopold worked as a hunter in the greater Gila National Forest area. Initially, he was a believer of the importance of extractive resources such as mining, timbering, hunting, and harnessing. However, as he wrote years later in his seminal book, A Sand County Almanac, a situation changed his perspective as it related to deer hunting and wolf populations. And he reflects in a short story in the Sand County Almanac after having shot a wolf, quote, "We reached the old wolf to watch a green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then and have known ever since." I always choke up when I read this. That there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. I was young then and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean a hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. A few years after his epiphany, and now as Gila's land manager, Leopold found himself forming a new management strategy that is best summed up from another quote of his. This doesn't make me choke up, but it's incredibly on spot. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of a biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Thus, he began the process of managing the Gila wilderness and its wild landscape. And in 1924, through his efforts, lobbying for this need to manage the Gila as a natural landscape, he was able to convince the Forest Service that they should designate 500,000 acres of the Gila as a primitive area, the first de facto wilderness in the US. That is pretty cool. As I have aged, my time backpacking has dwindled, but my time disappearing into desolate and isolated landscapes has increased. There are many vast, desolate, and untrammeled landscapes on the edge of designated wilderness, easily visited with today's recreational vehicles. I have spent hundreds of days traveling the Basin and Range province of Nevada, California, and Oregon, and the Mojave Desert of California and Arizona. I am emotionally drawn to these vast regions and see the desert landscape interspersed with storm-catching mountain ranges as a haven or heaven for the complexities, insecurities, and heartache that is part of life. Exemplary of this region is the Central Nevada State Park Berlin ichthyosaur, which Chris and I actually led a UU group to when Chris and I were members of the Sacramento Church a number of years back. This park is wonderfully isolated, and it protects the old silver mining town of Berlin, Nevada, long since vacated, and an ichthyosaur fossil site that was actually first identified by some UC Berkeley students decades and decades ago. From that camp area situated amongst pinyon juniper landscape on the western flank of the Shoshone Mountains, one can look seemingly forever. And the only sign of humans are the contrails left by airliners passing overhead. Near and to the east is a favorite hike, Arc Dome, which rises 11,000 feet over the dry Reese River Basin. The peak is conical and far above the hardiest of wind-contorted white pines. Summiting Arc Dome is a pilgrimage for me, not only for the exhilarating views, but also the remnants of rock shelters used by members of the long-defunct U.S. Signal Corps, which John Muir was a member and who was actually stationed at one point on Arc Dome. Untrammeled landscapes are my church. I find myself drawn lovingly to arid landscapes that are easy to meander through, where each plant is viewed singularly, and the meandering route allows me to easily journey. As a barometer of my emotional draw to any given landscape, I apply my own curious scale. I ask myself, is this a landscape that I could spend an eternity in? Although I don't believe in an afterlife, it is useful to me in how I perceive the openness, comfort, and kindness of a particular geography. I'll close with a third favorite Aldo Leopold quote. Of what avail are 40 freedoms without a blank spot on the map? As a quick aside, at one point early in my career as an environmental planner for a public entity, I saw no harm in including this quote on the back of my business card. Unfortunately, higher-ups did, and I had to have new business cards printed. Thank you.